Welcome to the OMG Tarot podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. Today, we're talking about the Empress. Here's why. The Empress came up as a point of discussion during our World episode a few weeks ago, and so I didn't want to completely close the door on her. But the Hermit came up also, and so I asked over on Instagram, what do people want to hear about next? More people said the Hermit, but people expressed interest in the Empress, and we are going to do all of the major arcana cards by the end of this season of the podcast, so it just made sense that the Empress would follow. Who is the Empress? The Empress is the archetypal mother. What does that mean? It means that she symbolizes all things that you might consider to be maternal, like nurturing and cultivating. She's associated with abundance and fertility, and in some cases, self-sacrifice in order to ensure that what or who you're cultivating grows up successfully. Let's take a look at the image because we see a lot of indicators of this sense of fertility and abundance. We see her sitting in a field of wheat. She herself is grounded pretty solidly here in this field of wheat, and we could see that as she's rooted and she's surrounded by this very critical crop that we're growing and we're eventually going to nourish ourselves with. Then, building on that idea of abundance and growth, we can look over to the background where we see lots of trees behind her. So, a lot of times, all of this plant imagery largely speaks to what's grounding you and what's keeping you secure. It's very pentacle-y, which, keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to circle back to this idea of pentacles, the Empress, and kind of some overlapping themes, but first, I really want to focus on some of her other images here. In her right hand, she's holding a scepter that has a clear orb on top of it. We could read this as her being in control and being the ruler of her domain, which in this case is the domain of all things that are fruitful and abundant. We could say she's directing it, and she's perhaps the one who's deciding, how am I going to cultivate these crops, and how am I going to nurture those who depend on me? I know strategic isn't typically a keyword associated with the Empress, but in my mind, I think it fits. She isn't just somebody who's hanging out in a great big field of wheat. She's the one who's tasked with cultivating this wheat and the one with the responsibility of harvesting it and processing it and making it available for all those who depend on her. In a lot of ways, she's a provider all the same as some of the more traditional provider figures like our Hierophant and our Emperor. And I think this might go a little bit against this grain of this idea of these male figures in the deck are the protectors and the providers, while the females are the nurturers. And I think that's a reflection of the world we live in today, that we can't box up these characters based on their gender, but rather recognize how are they making unique contributions, because she's quite protective, and honestly, name someone more protective than a mother to me. I think, if anything, protectiveness is probably perhaps the most maternal of traits. She's protective because she loves and values all of those who she's raising and who depend on her. Because let's take a look over at that heart-shaped, do we want to call it a pillow, a pillar that supports her, anything like that? But the heart-shaped thing that she's kind of sitting on that's got the Venus symbol on it, the Empress is associated with the planet Venus. In astrology, Venus is the planet that has to do with what you love and what you value and what you really cherish and hold close. It can speak to things like interpersonal connection and the beauty that can arise through deliberate, intentional collaboration. And then if we wanted to go a bit further with astrology, which I think we might expand upon in a future episode, but Neptune is considered to be the higher octave of Venus. So when you think of different planets as being higher and lower octaves of each other, think of them as having similar themes, but on a smaller or larger scale. So while Venus is all about love and beauty and value in things that are quite close to you and very tangible and approachable, Neptune is more like being awestruck by pondering the scale of the universe and seeing the beauty in how elegantly all of the cosmic systems and things work together to create and support life. In other words, you could even conceptualize the lower and higher octaves between planets as being the mundane and the spiritual applications of them. They're both necessary, they're both important, and they're both part of our lives. And if you've been listening with me for a while, you've probably caught on to that dichotomy showing up in the tarot deck, this idea of as above, so below. What's happening here is kind of mirroring what's happening far beyond our comprehension. And this is where we get into the spiritual side of tarot, which I really try not to expand upon too much in this podcast because I want to keep things practical and I want to keep things accessible to all listeners who can come in and just listen and learn about the tarot cards and then apply that in a way that makes sense for them and their practice and their perspective. I'm not here to tell you what to believe or how to conduct your practice, but tarot cards do reflect a lot of different spiritual concepts, and finding a way to conceptualize them for yourself, I think, will make you a more effective tarot card reader and really deepen your relationship with the deck. Next, I want to draw your attention to something else in this card that you've seen elsewhere, and it's that red and white color scheme. We've seen this a lot in the tarot deck, and it's because it's a recurring theme. And I also would like to just point out that when you see symbols repeated from card to card, you can think of them as permutations on the same theme. So by permutations, I mean it's not the same thing repeated verbatim, but kind of switched around a bit to highlight different aspects of it. A permutation is just one of the numerous ways that a collection of ingredients can be arranged or assembled. And to bring back an analogy that I used a while back now on this podcast, think about Taco Bell's menu. There really aren't very many individual ingredients on that menu. There's ground beef, there's shredded lettuce, there's tomatoes, there's cheddar cheese, and there are hard and soft taco shells. And with that handful of ingredients, they arrange a whole lot of different options. You can get a Crunchwrap Supreme, you can get a chalupa, you can get a cheesy gordita crunch. And no, this podcast is not sponsored by or affiliated with Taco Bell. I just think they're a really great example of taking a small collection of ingredients and turning that into a whole lot of different possible arrangements. Each of those menu items is a permutation of that small collection of ingredients. And bringing it back to tarot, because what do tarot cards have to do with Taco Bell's menu? Well, we've seen this idea of the red and white coming together to symbolize the combination of purity and freshness and innocence with passion and drive. We've seen that a couple of times. We saw it on The Magician. We've seen it on Temperance. We saw it on Death. We'll see it on the Hierophant. It shows up over and over because the Fool's Journey largely concerns the bringing of your action and your drive to become a more enlightened, spiritually developed version of yourself. And you don't lose your original self in doing that, you evolve your original self. That's what the white reference is. It's a reference to where you've started from and your openness to being changed by wherever it is that your passion takes you. Because let's look a little more critically at how white and red show up in the Empress. Her outfit is mostly white with some red on it, and underneath she's sitting on a large orangey red pillow, and then she's got some red blankets beneath her. She's also very comfortable here. I think it's worth noting that not only is she rooted and secure, she's cozy. She's exactly where she wants to be. She set this nest up for herself, and she's very relaxed and very comfortable in her position. And what is she couched in? She's couched in her passion and her drive. She wants to be here. And I think we really want to emphasize that the Empress is not burdened or put out by everything that she does to cultivate and nurture that wheat and, more symbolically, the Fool as he moves along his journey. She's happy to hold his hand and guide him, and she's proud of the progress that he's making. And I think this is where she feels like a very pentacle-y card to me. She's here to ground and to nourish and to provide tangible support. So, how is the Empress different from the Queen of Pentacles? And how is she different from any of the queens, really? Because she's the archetypal mother, but when we talked about the queens, we mentioned how they're essentially the moms of the tarot deck. There's certainly quite a bit of overlap between Empress energy and Queen energy, but here's how I differentiate them. The queens are part of the minor arcana, which means that they're more concerned with the day to day. They're a bit more focused than our major arcana cards, which really speak to big picture themes. So think of it like majors are eras of your life and big picture themes versus minors are day to day and what am I literally doing and what am I physically doing. And then to break that down a bit further, I often read the court cards as specific roles that you're playing, whether they're roles that you are already finding yourself in or roles that you're being called to play in a specific scenario. In any case, I read each of those queens as a lot more focused than the Empress. Perhaps even specialized would be the right word. For example, I read the Queen of Swords as someone who's intently focused on knowledge and objective facts and objective truth. And being a queen, she's one to pull all that knowledge toward her and use it decisively. Our Queen of Pentacles similarly pulls toward and is magnetic, but being the Queen of Pentacles, she's one who's pulling abundance and tangible assets toward her. So if anyone's got a really well-placed portfolio, it's the Queen of Pentacles. She's got stocks, bonds, precious metals. She probably doesn't have crypto, but maybe she does. Nonetheless, our Queen of Pentacles knows how to set herself and her family up for a very stable future. The Empress is who the four queens become when they can combine. The Empress has everyone and everything covered because being a major arcana card, she's a lot more layered and a lot more nuanced and complex. And when we look at this card, let's take a look at what elements we see represented. We see quite obviously Earth represented with her wheat and the trees that are off in the background. But then we also see water represented in that waterfall that's over on the right-hand side. So we know we have grounding and stability and abundance, and we also have emotions here. She's someone who's willing to emote and willing to be emotionally free. Now, where do we see fire and air here? I suppose we don't. You could make the argument that fire is represented a bit more subtly in the red imagery, and perhaps that air is just ever present, but focusing on the ones that are more overtly depicted, I would say that's because those are really her focal points. She's primarily providing stability and emotional support. In contrast, her partner, the Emperor, also doesn't have air overtly depicted in his card. He has, just like her, earth and water, but his is different. His is big, jagged-faced mountains in the background, and then along the bottom of the card, he's got a little itty-bitty stream. If anything, you might expect more fire in his card because he's associated with the sign Aries, and that's a fire sign. So where is his passion? Well, check out his outfit. Notice what color he's wearing and what color he's only got a little teeny bit of versus her outfit. He's a lot redder, isn't he? We'll talk more about the Emperor and contrast him with the Empress in a few weeks, but for now let's put our attention back on the Empress because this is her episode. Her outfit may be primarily white, but it's covered in an image of a fruit. And it's not just any fruit, it's a pomegranate. Pomegranates are often associated with fertility, and we could read this depiction as a reference to the myth of Persephone and her mother Demeter. I'm not going to recount the whole story here, but basically in the myth, Persephone went down to the underworld and while she was there ate 6 pomegranate seeds, and that's why we have 6 months of cold, barren, wintry weather and 6 months of warm, flourishing, lovely summer weather throughout the year. And so the pomegranate seed became associated with this idea of fertility and abundance, and we see it a few times in our tarot deck. Notably, we also see it on the banner behind the High Priestess, and she's somebody else we're going to talk about pretty soon. So, last, I want to talk about the symbolism of the Empress's crown because take a look at that crown on her head. That is one fancy crown. And you'll notice it has 12 stars. Those 12 stars line up with the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 12 months of the year. I'm reading this as a reminder that all things go in cycles, and when we're looking at the Empress, we're particularly highlighting the point in the cycle where there's lots of abundance. This is a manifestation stage. And the crown, along with that scepter, here symbolize that she's in charge of that. She's the ruler of the abundance, and she's the one in charge of bringing things to fruition. She's very powerful, and she's benevolent. I think she's a very kind, fair, gentle leader, but a strong leader nonetheless. So, what does it mean when you pull her up in a reading? Well, let's find out. When you pull up the Empress in a tarot card reading, you're pulling up themes of abundance and manifestation and nurturing. You're dealing with that mother archetype, and sometimes the Empress can symbolize you leaning into that role, or you in relation to your own mother or maternal figures in your life. In any pull, it's about that action of cultivating and gardening and taking care of whatever it is you're being nourished by or busy nourishing. So things like, well, what am I pruning? What am I watering? What am I fertilizing? What am I really putting all of my time and effort and energy into in order to see it grow up well and be successful? Or am I the crop? So let's do a sample pull involving the Empress. I'm going to ask my tarot cards, what's on the docket for me and my business for Q1 2025? Because we're sitting here toward the end of October, and I'm looking forward to, well, what comes next. In fact, I'm going to structure this poll a little bit differently. I'm going to use the Empress as a significator, and by that, I mean I'm not going to randomly pull her out, since on this podcast, all of our example polls have the feature card being pulled out and specifically used. So I'm going to use her to symbolize what will I be manifesting and what will I be nurturing and being the Empress of in Q1 of 2025. So with her as a significator, I'm going to pull 2 more cards to take a look at, well, specifically, what will I be Empressing Q1? So we shuffle, 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 and I've pulled the Knight of Wands and Strength. All right, so I am going to be cultivating a rather fiery first quarter next year. With the Knight of Wands, I see this as charging forward into a new interest and perhaps a new passion. I think there's going to be a very deliberate reordering of what I pursue and what I put my energy into Q1 of 2025, and that at first this might kind of feel a bit Wild Westy, a bit kind of like, well, we're going to pursue this and we don't know where this is going to go, but I'm following a passion and following a dream here. And then followed up with Strength, I kind of wonder if I'm not going to see immediate returns on this and instead going to be against maybe my better judgment, maybe third-party opinions, sticking with it because I'm enjoying it, or I really genuinely believe that there's going to be a payoff, or it's going to turn into something bigger and better in some way. If you remember back to Strength, it often involves things like standing on your own even when you're the only one who holds a certain position, and fighting for what you know to be true. So, all right, new direction, Q1 2025. Alrighty, let's do this thing. And that concludes our discussion on the Empress for today. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Tune in next week for our Halloween edition. We're going to be discussing reader horror stories from real-life tarot readers from across my network, so you definitely don't want to miss that one. And as always, if you enjoyed what you heard, please give me a good review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help. I know you hear that in probably every single podcast you listen to, and hosts say it because it's true. So, if you could do that, that would be super duper. And if you're in the New Jersey or New York City area and you're planning a holiday party and you'd like to make tarot part of that party, reach out. I do corporate events, birthday parties, all sorts of things. So, where can you find me? You can head over to my website at omgtarot.com, or you can find me on Instagram where my handle is its underscore omg underscore tarot. And that about wraps it for today. So, thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye bye.